Danny is the manager of enterprise automation at WoodmenLife, and he's focused on improving test management processes with the organization. So Justin, yeah, you can turn your camera off now if you want. Danny spent more than 10 years in quality assurance roles, and he and I have been chatting over this thing like for weeks now. We've had various conversations about things you can do in the software development process, how to improve your practice, etc. And it's like we almost feel like there's a show or a podcast in here or something somewhere, because he's got a lot of really fascinating experience that it's very practical about helping an organization to be more successful.
Thanks everyone for attending. My name is Danny Oslin. I'm the manager of enterprise automation at WoodmenLife. Been with the company just a short period of time, about 1.5 years currently. Prior to that, I worked at another company for a little over 10 years. Was in charge of QA as well as the automation efforts there. And so in coming to WoodmenLife, we just transformed from waterfall over to Agile, and we are using SAFe 5.0 for our Agile methodology. And then looking at how to bring automation to the company. And typically, I know from a QA manager standpoint, we think automation is testing automation, and this is a little bit more. It's the automation of everything that we can potentially automate, as long as it brings and delivers value to the company.
So Danny, we're seeing your presenter screen, so you either want to swap screen on the display settings at the top left there, or yeah, stop share and reshare. Also will do it. We still see the presenter screen. And boom.
How's
Bingo.
that?
Very good.
So that is me. I will move us over to slide number 2. So our journey. Our journey, like I said, we just transformed over from waterfall into Agile, and we're about 2 years into that journey. But then, looking at our automation, but then more importantly, looking at getting quality embedded within those Agile teams. It's one thing when you say, we want to be Agile. You don't just become Agile suddenly and then everything starts working well. And you certainly don't get to, a high level of quality right out of the gate either. Some of the typical ways that waterfall follows along, where testing is always something that's done afterwards, are some of the testing strategies that we've had to begin to address and try to resolve, even from just the manual perspective, that enables us to build the foundation to get the creation of the automated testing in place. And in coming in and looking at things, everybody has a way that things have been done, and they had transformed over to Agile just after I had started, so they were learning that. And I think the conception was everybody thought, so this is how we do things, and so we want to bring automation in to automate this testing. And I kind of had to look at it and get people to understand, automation, especially on the testing realm inside of an Agile environment, the whole concept of shift left. We can touch on that a little bit later as to what that means, but primarily coming to the realization, we're not going to automate the way things are. We have to look at things a little bit more holistically and get an understanding around the process itself to change how we do the work that we're trying to get accomplished. So we're going to do the same work, but we're going to accomplish that work in a different way. And some of that, like I said, involving the quality, which is primarily what people think of, but then really get the understanding that quality belongs on the Agile team itself. So in beginning to come to best practices from a development standpoint and even a requirements gathering standpoint, that's where quality begins. So you want to get your QAs engaged way up front so that they have the understanding of, how are we going to test this? What is it going to take? And involving those people in those discussions. but then, getting developers to understand the importance of unit testing, and stop looking at the UI itself as this is the entry point into testing. So those are some of the challenges that we've had in front of us. So uh, that's kind of, in a nutshell, our little journey at the top.
Yeah, so I think, Danny, what's interesting, right? Like we heard Cole say this in the keynote about, if you automate what you've already got and it's really like efficient and mature, life is going to get a lot better. But if it's not, then you're going to magnify the problems. And you're kind of saying the same thing here, right? Like that your goal wasn't just to automate what you're already doing, but what's the validity of the argument around, hey, I just want to do automation. I don't want to change our world versus, you know, what and why should we change and what's the justification for changing how we work?
Correct, correct. And some of that is to get the understanding around that testing. So, typically if we look at a sprint, and most people that are agile, you're running on a 2, maybe a 3 week iteration cycle that you're working on. And if the goal is to deliver the software, um, developers are usually head down at the beginning of the sprint and they're working away, and QAs, trying to develop the test approach. But it's trying to get the understanding. You do not want to wait until the end. If you're waiting to the end to get all of the testing done, including the regression testing, right at the end of that sprint, developers kind of need to stop. QA has to get involved and start testing thing and uncovering the defects, and then you're running the risk of, are we going to be able to deliver that software at the end of that sprint cycle? What if something went wrong, or what if you didn't catch a defect or you uncovered it? Then you're making decisions on, do we want to go ahead and push this release in with these defects, or do we want to get those addressed and maybe delay this release? So trying to find a way to uncover those sooner in the process. And like I said, we're typically with the waterfall mindset, that testing is something that's occurring after the development. And you really want to get the testing, ahead of the development and during development. So that's been kind of, one of those challenges, one of those reasonings to get people to understand that. The ultimate goal that we have is to have true continuous integration, continuous development. And I always looked at that and I thought, well, if that is the goal where we want to push a button and have something be deployed, what has to occur just prior to that? And that led into, how do we know what it is that we're going to test and when we're going to test this? And even without, automated testing in place, starting to understand that the more quality that you can put into the entire process is going to help you deliver on that. This first point, integrating the business needs and requirements early into the dev test cycle. We're still kind of looking at this process where there's testing that is occurring in UAT, user acceptance testing, that is being developed and determined after we've done all of the development work. And trying to work with the business to say, we are delivering this to you because our business is our customer, but where we have additional testing that is taking place after we are completely done with all the development and what the QAs have tested on the Agile teams, getting that understanding, we should have those tests known to us prior to starting the development work, because those are our requirements. That's how we know that we're delivering what the business wants to them. So it's trying to bring all of quality into kind of a focus or a spotlight onto the Agile teams themselves, not letting them do their work and then conducting that testing after.
Yeah, and I think, Danny, in our other conversation, like you have talked about this fact that testers often find themselves in a position where, or the organization, right, like working with the testers, say, well, how are we doing on our tests? And they say, well, we haven't started yet because the code's not ready, right? What's your perspective? We know that coding starts once they have a requirement. When does the tester actually begin work in a practical sense?
So from a practical sense, day one of the sprint, it kind of falls to, we use the term three amigos concept, where you have an understanding between your analyst or even your product owner, whoever is writing out the requirements. Um, typically developers get in there and have discussions so that they understand what they're doing, but it's just as important to have your QA resources in those discussions as well. Because as you're working on something, if you don't have a mature QA process in place, those testers need to understand, well, how are we going to test this? What environments are we going to need? What data are we going to need? And in those discussions with QA Dev and the BSA, everyone should have a very clear understanding of what is going to be required from their role in order to accomplish those goals within the sprint. If a tester isn't privileged to that knowledge or information prior to the work beginning, then they're spending time within the sprint gathering that information, and then they're causing churn on the teams because they have to go ask questions of developers. They might have to go ask of the analyst or get clarity from what the product owner was expecting. And so you have kind of, silos where people aren't having the same shared understanding of the work that they're trying to get done going into that sprint. A tester, if there aren't test cases already created from a test case repository, those test cases need to be created, and that takes time, but they should be doing that while the developers are already working on getting the development done. And then, at the same time, having developers understand the importance of unit tests, that testing is shifting that testing earlier in the development life cycle so that you're ensuring that everything is working the way that it should be from the developer's understanding, and then even going into a functional test at a service level to ensure that things are functioning properly, so that by the time they do deploy the code out there for QAs to finally put their hands on it and start the testing, the testers have to have developed that test plan, all the adequate and appropriate test cases that they need to ensure we are delivering what was expected and that everything works.
Yeah. So I think we've actually led ourselves right into our next bullet, if you want to advance the slide, right? Because we're talking about earlier now. So, I wanted to have this little bit of a discussion about the shifting test to the left, because we've heard it several times today and we hear it all the time. Like, what is it? Why do I care, and how do I do it? Right?
Right. So some of that, it begins with, if you're trying to reach a true CI/CD level where you have continuous integration and continuous development. If you look at that model where QAs primarily go through the UI, you're waiting too far to the right on the timeline. So how can you begin to test the code that you're developing sooner? And then that's what they mean by, shift this to the left. So what kind of testing can you do prior to a UI test if that is what you're developing on? And there's, all the different levels. The first step coming from a UI to the left would be, start to look at service level or API testing, where can we test the back end without the UI? And then going further back to your unit test, what testing can we put in place to ensure that the code that we're working on is working properly? And then even farther to the left, like I said, having QAs involved in that, analysis and requirements gathering process, so that a QA may have knowledge that the BSA is unaware of, or even the product owner might not understand how it works, to be able to point something out to say, well, if we touch this particular piece of functionality, it's also going to affect that over there. And sharing that information, or a developer being able to say, I'm touching this little piece of code so that we can facilitate the change that's required, but that code I'm touching actually hits other areas of functionality within our system. So I'm going to make these changes, QA, you're aware of what we're trying to do from a requirement standpoint, but also get the understanding there's other things that we need to make sure that we didn't break along the way. So it allows that QA resource to look into those other areas and determine how does it interact with these other areas, what test cases do I need to ensure that that quality is there. And so when you think of shifting testing to the left, it's really looking at the timeline and understanding where can I conduct testing as soon as possible to ensure that what it is that I'm delivering, whether it's a small piece of code or whether it's a very large piece of code, but testing as soon as possible and testing, early enough in the game that you can uncover a defect instead of waiting all the way to the end of a cycle or a delivery, whether that's within a program iteration or even within a sprint. If you're waiting that long to finally start to test it, it's just too late. And then you put your delivery at risk because you're not getting that testing done soon enough.
Yeah, yeah, it's and I think this leads us into our next topic here, right? Which is this late cycle testing is typically this UI testing, and I hate to say the word easy, but UI testing is easy in the sense that it's easy to understand, right? Like we know how to do it. It's a well understood problem, but why not just push everything through that? Why not just do that, right? And the other part of that was, you started talking about coverage, which may or may not be a common discussion that a tester has.
Correct. I think typically QA resources look at, they're looking at the user interface. They're looking at that UI because that is how they can interact with that code without any additional tools or any additional knowledge. But it leaves you kind of open to when can you begin testing? And if you think about the UI, you have to get that code developed, you have to get it deployed, put into an environment, and then someone can finally touch it. So again, it kind of touches on the shift test or shift left again, where we need to be able to test sooner. But if the only access point for testing is through the UI, again, it's waiting too long in that development life cycle. So, starting to understand that, UI testing from a manual perspective, it's usually about the only way you can conduct that testing. So how do you start to break that apart? And this kind of came, to me when I discovered, it was probably 6-7 years back. We were automating, but we were automating with UI and only UI. And they had set down a goal to say, I want you to take automated testing and be able to apply it in sprint, meaning everything that we develop, we want to have automated testing to conduct the testing, but our only entry point was through that UI. And we achieved that. We found ways to facilitate that, where the developer is working on the code, automation engineer is working on writing out that automation, and when they delivered the code, the automation was ready, and then you could execute against it. It takes a real high degree of collaboration between QA and dev to pull that off. They have to make the code more testable, make how they write the code for the UI, make it easy to identify all those controls. So we achieved that, but in the end, what I found was it doesn't really matter what automated testing approach you choose. Eventually, you're going to end up with so much automation that getting that testing executed in a small enough window of time to help you deliver at the end of the sprint becomes insurmountable. In other words, it doesn't scale. It's kind of like you've automated that UI testing. However, now you have to run all of it to get it done, which is essentially the same as saying, well, we need to hire more QAs. We need to get more QAs in here to get all this testing done. And automation runs into the same type of problem. One of the things that I really like about Parasoft's platform is you get that coverage. And when we talk about coverage, it's not just what is our test coverage for this application? Well, how do you define that and how do you measure it? Parasoft, by looking at it at the test that you're conducting, whether it's a unit test, if it's a service test, if it's a UI test, or even if it's a manual tester sitting there testing, provides you the ability to get an understanding. When I execute this particular test case, I know exactly which lines of code are being executed inside of that application. So now you can start to look at things from the perspective of, if I have changed this code, uh, do I have enough testing that is addressing all of the changes that we have? And then you can look at, a little bit better, how much of the application are we actually testing when we do this? Now, of course, just because a line of code is executed, it doesn't mean that all the possible permutations are there. So you still need to have, an understanding around what tests are being conducted, because multiple tests could execute the same line of code. But breaking off of the UI, which usually automated testing with UI, it's long running. It can be a little bit brittle until you really work it to get it stabilized. But it's that time consuming measure. If you can break that UI off and conduct most of your functional testing through service level testing or API testing to ensure all of these things are working properly that deliver that data to present through the UI, but then test the UI itself by using virtual services, which is what you get through Parasoft, SOA Test, and Virtualize, and using CTP to help you provision the environments you need. So you can say, I can get all the same functional testing done through API testing that I would have been previously doing through the UI, but now I can also test and verify that that UI is functioning in the proper way by breaking it away from the back end and using virtual services to send the same traffic to the UI to ensure that everything is working and you don't have those back end lags. So in addition to that, then you don't really have to have all that functional testing up at the UI layer. Now, as you're doing all those different levels, again, that kind of comes back to the coverage, getting an understanding of exactly what it was that you did test, or getting an insight into just how much of that app we're testing. Because if our coverage is really low, single digit percentages, or even 20, 25%, that's a whole lot of code that you're never really ensuring that you're getting tested. So
Yeah, and shockingly, that number that you just threw out there unfortunately falls in line with the numbers that Cole showed us at the beginning, right?
yes,
And I think,
we're in the same boat.
yeah, and I think that the discussion you and I have had about this over the last few weeks is that I would have loved to have stuck in like a mean poll here, right, to trick people and then tell them that they're silly. But the KPI for testing should not be how many tests have I created, right? It's
Correct.
rather what you've been alluding to here is how few tests can I create to do what I need to do.
Exactly. Exactly. It's an insight that I think is real valuable. I didn't have this before, and we had, what was it, around 5,000 or 6,000 test cases, which typically everybody, oh, that's really good. We knew what the tests were doing, but were all those tests really applicable? Did it make sense to always run those test cases? And it goes to some of the metrics. A lot of people want to know, how many test cases do we have? How many test cases are automated? You could have a million test cases and you could have a million of them automated, but are you really testing what you should be? Or are you really understanding how all of the systems interact with each other to ensure that I'm making sure that everything works versus I'm making sure just one specific function works in a particular scenario? And then on the worst side, how many tests do I have when I have thousands of them that are doing the same thing or testing the same functionality? So being able to get those insights, and even more important, if you've shifted testing to the left, you should always be cognizant that if I do uncover a defect through a test, and if that test is farther down to the right, meaning it's later in the cycle. Um, and if it does uncover a defect, you don't want to just look at that test and say, oh, great, this particular functional test that's a service level test uncovered a bug. We got it fixed. It didn't make it all the way to the UI testing even farther in the process. But then revisiting that and saying, can I maybe develop a unit test that would have uncovered that same defect, and thereby either negate the need for the test later or to augment the testing that is being done with that understanding from a coverage perspective as well.
Yeah, yeah. So let's move on now to a little more specific, right? Like what's the fundamental testing strategy and how do you achieve it, right? You've got your next bullet point here. Let's chat about that. We've got 3 minutes, so
So, like I said, for us, changing that testing strategy, it's getting the understanding of testing sooner, and embedding that quality onto the shoulders of the entire Agile team, meaning that a developer doesn't just code things away and then deploy it out to an environment and let QA make a determination whether it's going to work or not. And along with that, getting the quality up there with the conversations between QA and your analyst or your product owners to get the understanding. And are we writing the proper requirements? Are we thinking of everything that we possibly can? Being as prepared as possible before we even start the work, that we know what we're doing, we know how we're going to do it, and we also know how we're going to test it and where we're going to test it and when we're going to test it. So along with that, best practices from a development standpoint. If you're creating a service, it's really important to write that service definition. If you are, putting code out, and you're developing, getting those unit tests in place so that you're ensuring it's doing what it's supposed to do, and then moving up to that functional testing where we're saying now we're going to start testing that particular service or that particular application by itself in isolation, ensuring it does what it's supposed to do before we, integrate with other systems. And then you expand your testing, more functionality and more end-to-end scenario flows, so that you're doing as much of that through automation as you can, as fast as you can, all throughout that process. So when you finally get to that UI, hopefully it's a little better world for the QAs. They're not having to ensure that all of the functionality is being tested through the UI. It takes kind of a change in mindset, which can be a little bit difficult because QAs, typically aren't technical, and developers usually don't like testing. So you got to kind of bring those two roles together and get them to understand that the quality isn't a QA department. It's not a QA tester. It's not something that happens after development is done. It is understanding that that testing has to belong to the team, and bring the right tools to bear so that you can conduct that testing, but not just conduct it, but understand what it is testing itself.
yeah. And I think that's some real interesting stuff, Danny. And real quick, just as a final summary, right? Like we've talked about a lot of the things that you've done with Parasoft, but like from a solution stack perspective, what are the technologies that you're using for testing, right? Like service virtualization, test impact analysis, whatever. What are you
So
using?
we have, we start off with static code analysis. So we're looking at, security violations. We're looking at code quality. Then we're moving into, unit tests where we want, a good amount of unit testing and code coverage, that talks about that, the pyramid that everybody has inverted typically. From the unit test, then we go into, API or service level testing. We're leveraging service virtualization so that we can develop in parallel at the same time, using the tool for more than just testing. But then environment provisioning as well, where we can stand up environments quickly, surround them with virtual services to test those things in isolation, and then go into an integration level of testing where once we've determined that that particular service in isolation is working the way that we expect it to, now we integrate that with other services and say now start to do more, more functional testing, but with more of the services around it, and then a full integration, and then finally an automated UI testing level. And then if there's exploratory testing that we can do afterwards, or manual testing that needs to be done because complexity of creating the automation may be, untenable, or it may not make sense. So that's kind of, what we've brought in from a Parasoft perspective, with the tools, from the static analysis all the way to the end, even from the manual testing side, where when a manual tester is sitting down and doing their testing, we're getting the code coverage metrics from that as well.
Yeah. So thanks, Danny. It's been fascinating. It's always fun to chat with you, and look forward to future things with you.